Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Gilbert, obviously. It's Saturday morning, March 14th, and I am sitting in my office at LMU. It's a corona-free zone. My hands are completely clean after 20 seconds of vigorous scrubbing, and I've wiped everything down here. And what I'm going to be doing is, depending upon my endurance, recording up to 3 videos that I'm going to post online for you guys on Brightspace. So the first one is going to be on physical motor development during adolescence. And the second one is going to be on social emotional development in adolescence. And the third one is going to be on just prepping you for how the fourth quiz is going to work and how exam 2 is going to work and how the panels are going to work. I wrote some stuff to you emailed it to you. So you should have a general idea, but I thought I would put it in this form too. And so when the lectures on adolescence are up and explain all the panels and tests and quizzes, we should be all good through the second section of the class, which is the section on childhood and adolescence. Anyway, then after that, you probably got the word this morning from President Snyder that where the classes shut down, all classroom instruction, events, everything is shut down here through the end of the spring semester. So I'm scrambling to get everything done today and tomorrow to finish up the second section. And then after that, I'm gonna prepare a new syllabus for you that will explain everything for the month of April when we do the third section of the class on adulthood and aging. So that's the game plan, and let's start with the lecture on physical motor development in adolescence. Now, what I would suggest that you do as I'm going through this is to go on Brightspace and go to the slide presentation, the PowerPoint presentation that I developed for this stage of adolescence, because I'm going to basically just be going through that slide presentation and adding some, more information and making it clearer for you. Because I think if you, without the lecture, just doing it on the basis of the slide presentation might not be 100% clear. So that's the purpose of this lecture. I'm going to follow right along with the slide presentation and just give you, some additional information, elaborate a little bit so it's real clear for you. Okay? So let's start with the first slide, and the one that's headed Adolescence. And it notes that adolescence is a stage that starts at 13, and different people have different ideas about when it ends. Some people put 13 to 18. Some people put 13 to 20 or 21. Now, let me talk about those boundaries. 13 is easy. We know middle childhood ends, at the end of the 12th year, and adolescence begins at 13. And the reason that adolescence begins at 13 is that, you remember, every stage stops and a new stage begins when there's a major qualitative shift in one or more of the domains of development. So at the beginning, when we were going through the stage sequence and the narrative, I explained to you that the qualitative shift in development that ushers in the stage of adolescence is in the physical motor domain, which is that we, around the age of 13 is, little variation, but around the age of 13 is when we reach reproductive potential. That means that we're able to make babies. And that's a qualitative shift in the lifespan. I can't make babies, middle childhood. I can make babies, adolescence. All right? So that's a big deal. So that's what everybody understands as the movement into adolescence. The question is, though, where does adolescence end? And people have been struggling with this, and it may be the most challenging and fuzziest area of the developmental lifespan that I presented to you at the beginning of class. So because of that fuzziness, you'll have some people end at 18 arguing that, well, at 18, you have the right to vote, you have the right to own property, you have the right to get married without anybody's approval, you have a right to enlist or the obligation to be drafted into a war and fight and perhaps be injured and die for your country. You have the right in most places to determine if you buy alcohol or weed or in a legal manner. So there's a lot of social things that you can now do when you're 18 that you were not able to do before. And so some people say that adolescence should end at that point because legally you're more of an adult. Other people, will go all the way to 21 because there are certain states and jurisdictions where there are things that you cannot do until 21. And so when you reach full legal status, I guess, except for the fact that you can't rent a car on your own until you're 25. But other than that, I can't think of anything that someone at 21 can't do that any adult who's older, can do. So you might argue that across the nation, that you achieve full legal status in all jurisdictions at 21. So some people will, using that legalistic notion of the end of adolescence, they'll end it at 21 instead of 18. But anyway, the other one that some people do, and I kind of do this, is I think of it as ending at like 20. And the reason that, we'll talk about some changes later, but for many years I just ended at 20, is because if you go 13 through 19, you get all the teenage years in one category. So that's a little bit based upon conceptual neatness, that's a nice way to say it. But both of those things, just conceptual clarity or neatness or legal obligations, just seem so arbitrary compared to other transitions like moving into, early childhood because of the rise of symbolic function. I mean, that's a qualitative shift in human functioning. And but to compare that to, being able to, vote or drive a car, these are just cultural kinds of conventions that could be changed. It's not something intrinsic to human capacity. It's more of a cultural designation. And certainly conceptual neatness, putting everything into one stage, is completely arbitrary and not a very persuasive thing. So you see what a mess that is, where adolescence ends and where adulthood begins. So we're going to solve that problem, at the beginning of our next section of the class when we go into adulthood and aging. And I'll show you how I think developmental psychology has come up with a good strategy. But for now, I just want to introduce you to the clarity of the beginning at 13 and the ambiguity of when it ends that has plagued developmental psychology for many, many years. All right. So the word, now let's go into physical and motor development. And I start with that stage because the word adolescence itself comes from a Latin word that means growth or to grow. And it's a very apt word to describe this stage because if you think about it, except for the period from conception until about 2 years, 2.5 years when we enter early childhood. So that's a period of about 3 years, a little more than 3 years, of where the egg is fertilized, the baby gestates in the mother, is born and goes through infancy and toddlerhood. That 3+ years from a single-celled organism to a preschooler is undoubtedly the greatest expansion and physical development of in the lifespan. But other than that period, when you go from a single-celled organism, really, to a walking, talking, moving, going to school preschooler, adolescence is the period of the most dramatic physical changes in the lifespan. All right? So let's go on to begin to talk about physical and motor development in adolescence. And the second slide, which is headed Physical Motor Development in Adolescence, explains this dramatic change. Now, it's related to a process which you have all heard of and gone through called puberty. Now, there's a misconception of puberty. Excuse me, I'm going to just move up a little bit and lean back because it's more comfortable. Anyway, a lot of people think that puberty is the same thing as reproductive potential. That you go through puberty and you hit reproductive potential at the same time. And that's not true. That's not accurate. Because as you'll see as we go through these slides, that reproductive potential is one of a number of events that are embedded in the puberty sequence, which is not a discrete event, but something that happens and unfolds over the course of several years and begins much earlier than reproductive potential. So the puberty sequence oftentimes begins around the age, somewhere between the age of 10 and 12. Now this is again, we're talking about normative data here. This is what happens in the typical case. But in some cases, puberty comes earlier for the child, significantly earlier, or significantly later. And toward the end of this lecture, I'm going to talk about these early pubescent and late pubescent children and what the developmental experiences are for having a somewhat unusual onset of puberty. Now, usually we stay away from atypical development and only talk about typical development, but it happens in enough cases that I think it bears talking about a little bit. All right? Just like we talked about C-sections, for example, which are not typical, but happen frequently enough that I wanted you to have an understanding about what that involves. All right? So anyway, puberty is divided into a primary event and then a series of secondary sexual characteristics that flow from the primary event. Now, as the slide says, the primary event of puberty is a change in the ratio of sex-specific hormones. So the sex-specific hormones for the female are estrogen and progesterone. The sex-specific hormones for the male is testosterone. But both females and males have testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. All those hormones are in both males and females. What determines the maleness or femaleness is the ratio of these hormones. So we see in young children, there's not a great deal of differentiation. Some there is, you can see differences, but the differences in the body, in the look of a young child is less distinct between males and females than in later years. And that's because both of them have estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, but the ratios haven't been altered through the puberty sequence. What happens in this primary event is that the production of estrogen and progesterone in the female goes up, so that, let's say the ratio is like this, and all of a sudden the production of estrogen and progesterone in the female goes up, so that the ratio is much heavier in terms of female-specific hormones. And for the male, the opposite happens. The estrogen and progesterone levels will stay largely constant, but the testosterone levels get boosted so that there's a different balance, a different hormonal balance. That's the primary event of puberty. That's what starts everything. Once that primary event happens, then there's a series of cascading physical changes, which we call the secondary sexual characteristics. Now, how does this change happen? Well, we know where it begins. There is a tiny kidney bean shaped and sized structure in the middle of the brain called the hypothalamus. You may remember this from your studies in brain and behavior, where you went through or even an intro psych, where you went through the basic physical organization and anatomy of the brain. And so the hypothalamus is in the midbrain, beneath the brain stem and the cerebral cortex, which has higher intellectual functions. But in the middle layer, there's a variety of structures, and one of them is the hypothalamus, okay? And literally, when I say it's shaped and sized like a kidney bean, I mean that. It's really that big, okay? So, in that tiny structure has had an oversized influence in the history of an individual's life and in the history of human culture. Because in that little structure are the neural pathways that govern human drives and appetites. So the drive of sexuality, the drive of hunger, the drive of thirst, the drive of aggression, all these things are controlled by the circuitry in this tiny little kidney bean structure. And there have been Nobel Prizes won where you can stimulate certain areas of the hypothalamus and have laboratory rats, for example, will if you stimulate the appetite centers of the hypothalamus, they will, eat or drink until they are exhausted or die. You can also stop eating and drinking. You could stimulate sexuality or aggression by activating these neural pathways. So this one has a big deal. So in the hypothalamus, somewhere in a typical person's life between 10 and 12, the hypothalamus sends signals to the pituitary gland, which is at the base of the skull, which then sends signals to the gonads, okay, which are the reproductive organs. That is the testicles for the male and the ovaries for the female. And it instructs these organs to ramp up production of sex-specific hormones. That is either estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone. Okay, now moving on to the second slide on the primary event of puberty. We're going to continue talking about this process. Now, we've noticed something interesting, and the age at which this process is beginning is about 2 years or so, 2.5 years earlier than it seemed to have occurred in the mid-1800s. So let's say we roll the clock back 175 years. So now we're talking contextual development, right? We're talking about a different context. So 175 years ago, it seemed like this process was occurring 2.5 years earlier. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because if you read novels, if you read diaries, if you read newspaper accounts, social historians have gotten a sense that, for example, the females would be talking about having their periods, and through information in the stories, the age of the writer was apparent that they were like maybe 15 and a half years old. And so we know from this archival, excuse me, little water. We know from these historical accounts that it was happening earlier. The question is, why? The theory is that the hypothalamus, and I'm speaking metaphorically here because on a molecular, chemical, electrical level, I mean, nobody understands this. It's miraculously complex. So I'm just speaking descriptively to you now that there's a belief and a theory that the hypothalamus somehow is reading the size of the girl or the boy. And when the size reaches a certain criteria level, now it could be the size is related to height, it could be related to weight, it could be related to musculature, it could be related to, height-weight ratios. We don't know exactly what the algorithm is, if you will, stored in the hypothalamus. But there's some kind of formula that the hypothalamus is responding to. And when it reads the physical properties of the child, it says, aha, this child has reached criteria size, therefore they're big enough and mature enough to make a baby, so let's get going, pituitary gland and sex organs, and start pumping out that new hormonal balance and getting ready to go and have a baby. That's the theory. Now, where did that theory come from? Here's the idea. We know that it seems like the body is going off of size and weight kinds of things because, for one, we know that women's periods, their first period, is not randomly distributed across the 12 months of the year. We know that while there are women who have their first periods in each of the months, there are some that have it in January and some in December and some in June. So all the months are covered. But more women have their periods for the first time in the second half of the year, which has more the colder months in it. Now, in the colder months, we usually will gain a few pounds as a mechanism, for staying warmer, okay? So people eat more as a way of insulating the body. And so you would assume that in the winter months, people would have a little bit more weight on them than they would in the warmer months. So the bodies would be bigger. That's one indication that the body may be monitoring the height, weight, body fat kind of issues. We also know that women who are stockier, we all have skeletal structures. Some people are what they call exomorphs, which have a very thin, kind of narrow structure. Some people, have a middle kind of frame, and other people have a thicker kind of frame, all right? Just how the skeletal structure, is, and everything else is laid, on top of that. We know that women who are have a wider, thicker skeletal structure, who would tend to be able to hold more weight on the body, they have their periods earlier than women who are kind of slight and narrow. We also know that women who, like for example, ballerinas, gymnasts who have very little fat on the body, have their periods on average later. And finally, in the clinical area, there's a lot of cases where women have started their period and then developed an eating disorder, where, like anorexia, where they're not eating, they're self-starving, and they get very, very thin. And even if their period started, when the eating disorder occurs, it stops. And so we think what's going on is the hypothalamus said, oh, I made a mistake. I thought this, young girl was actually bigger and had more fat content and was ready to reproduce, but I must have made a mistake. Let's shut down the system. So we have a lot of, evidence that all seems to point to that this is what the body is monitoring, okay? So why then would it be happening earlier now than, in industrial times? And the reason is that girls and boys are bigger today than they were 175 years ago. They're bigger, they're taller because of better health, um, more abundant food, like we talked about, high fat food. Everybody's getting bigger, sedentary lifestyles. All these things are leading human beings to be bigger than they were. And culture is rapidly changing. But in our brains, which are configured to life from thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago, we still are using height weight charts that are based upon hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. That the brain is not developing and adapting fast enough to the remarkable speed of cultural change. All right? That's the theory. All right. Going on to the next slide. So that's everything on the primary change of puberty, this hormonal change. And then once the primary change hits, it begins a series of 6 secondary sexual characteristics. Okay? So and these are 6 secondary sexual characteristics that unfold in a sequence for the female, and then 6 secondary sexual characteristics that unfold for the male. There are differences, obviously, anatomically and in the logic of the sequence for the female and for the male, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the invariance, the universality for all females throughout history, the progression of these steps and the progression of the steps for the male are universal for females and universal for males. You can find, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or what your skin color is or your religion or your country of origin or any of these contextual differences. You have in common that you've gone through the same sequence as anyone else in your sex. All right? So let's go through what these sequences are, and then I want to talk briefly about, beyond the anatomy, a different logic for the male and the female. Okay? So let's go to the next slide. And on this chart that I prepared, I have on the left column the 6 steps in order, and then I have the steps for the female, and then the steps for the male. Okay, so let me just quickly go through these. Most of them are self-explanatory, but I'm looking at the slide as I speak here. And so as we go through this, try to think if you see any differences in the logic of the sequence for females and the logic for the sequence of males, again, beyond the anatomy, which is obvious. All right. Now, for the females, the first sign that there's been a shift in the ratio of sex-specific hormones, that is, more estrogen, more progesterone is being pumped out. The first sign is that you'll see the emergence of the first breast tissue. All right? And then second, this is followed by the development of the first pubic hair. And then, number 3, the widening of the hips. So the young girl is expanding the pelvis and getting ready, of course, to make a baby. You need a little more room to push out that baby. The fourth one is that there'll be a growth spurt. Everybody in pre-adolescence or in adolescence goes through a growth spurt, and this is a major increase in size. After the growth spurt for the female, they reach reproductive potential. And this occurs in our culture right now at 12 years and 8 months. Now, this reproductive potential is not exactly the same always as the first menstrual period, because in some women, their first, sometimes even their first two periods are what they call anovulatory. That is, they do not ovulate. They do not release an egg in that cycle. Therefore, they still could not get pregnant, even though they're having their menstrual cycle. But sometimes it's the first menstrual cycle the woman has, they release an egg. It's ovulatory. So in that case, the beginning of menstruation and the arrival of reproductive potential are occurring at the same time. But sometimes there's a small gap of 1 or 2 months, but not a great gap. But anyway, the average age that a woman can make a baby is 12 years and 8 months in American culture right now. And that is, from these archival things, about 2.5 years earlier than in the mid-1800s. So where it was more like 15 years, 2 months was what social historians, concluded from this archival data. So that's a big change. Think about when you were 12 years and 8 months compared to 15 years, 2 months. That's a major hunk of maybe a 25% increase. I mean, if you are 55 versus 57 and a half, it's not such a big difference in maturity. But 12.8 to 15.2 is a huge, huge difference. So it's happening much earlier and at much earlier levels of maturity. Then finally, the puberty sequence for the female is ended with the completion, the sixth secondary sexual characteristic, the completion of pubic hair. All right? So all females ever born, ever present, and in the future go through this universal, non-contextual sequence. Now, the males also go through an invariant sequence, and the first sequence will be the growth of the genitalia. That is, the testicles and the penis get larger as with the increased production of testosterone. That's the first step. That's followed by the emergence of the first pubic hair, and that's followed then by the growth spurt, okay? And, that's followed by reproductive potential after the growth in the genitalia and the first pubic hair. The third one is reproductive potential, and that will be around 13 years, 0 months is the average age. Now, this is from more scientific understanding. If you ask boys, remember we said self-report is biased, and boys and the people will give you answers that they want you to think or is most desirable in their mind. So if you ask boys, they'll probably tell you they reach reproductive potential about 8.5 years old or something like that. Okay, but the fact is it's 13 years, 0 months. This is followed by the fourth step, which is the growth spurt, followed by voice and beard changes, the fifth stage. So the voice obviously gets deeper, and facial hair begins to emerge. And then finally, the completion of the pubic hair. Now, if you look at this sequence, you see in between the female and male sequence, I wrote around reproductive potential, next to reproductive potential for the females, I wrote a little note there. And this is the main difference, that females, if you look at this sequence beyond the anatomy, the main difference is that females have more overt signs of these physical changes prior to reproductive potential. Before a girl can make a baby, the secondary sexual characteristics are overt and observable. For example, the number one step is increased breast tissue, right? So that's observable. The second one, we can't observe unless the little girl was nude. You can't observe the emergence of the pubic hair, but you can observe the beginning of breast tissue, and you can observe the widening of the hips, and you can observe the growth spurt. They're all overt. If you're not blind or in denial, you know that when the girl is about to be able to make a baby, no parent, no caregiver should say, I had no idea that she could make a baby. Yes, you did. You didn't want to see it. What was right in front of your face. Because nature waves a gargantuan red flag in front of parents and teachers and adults and caregivers and says, this little girl can make a baby, folks. You need to talk with her. Okay? You need to begin to have some serious conversations. But the boy, if you look at the secondary sexual characteristics, unless you see the boy nude, you have no idea when they can make a baby. Because the only thing that happens before they can make a baby is the growth in the genitals and the emergence of the first pubic hair. Without seeing the boy nude, you have no idea that they can make a baby. So there the issue is when the boy gets close to age 13, even though they'll roll their eyes and giggle and get nervous, you need to start talking with them. All right? So nature gives you a guide. All right, last topic is the impact of variations on the timing of puberty. And I've written on the last slide in physical and motor development, I've listed the 4 variations. You can have, there's 2 for each sex. So you can have an early pubescent female, that means who begins the puberty sequence earlier than typical. And I'm not talking about a week or a couple of months. I'm talking about like a year or more. These are I'm talking about significant deviations from central tendency. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so these would be the outliers. Well, we can't see the outliers of our distribution. So you can have a female that has early pubescence or a female who has late pubescence. Similarly, you can have a male who has early pubescence and a male who has late pubescence. So let's go over to the last column, the disadvantages, and let me talk a little bit about that, and then the advantages, because all of them, they're not either good or bad. They all have their potential downside, and they all have their potential upside. And the attachment figures and the caregivers can, knowing these potential stressors and advantages, can help the child move through them. Okay? So let's just go through them so you have knowledge of how these early versus late patterns might affect the child's development. So the first one is the early pubescent female, okay? So because females have their growth spurt prior to males, and the early pubescent females would be the first females to have the growth spurt, these girls, are going to be the tallest, largest kids in the class. If you go back to your middle school picture, they take those class photos, I'll bet you in 90 percent or more of those middle school pictures, the biggest kid in the class is a female because they're an early pubescent female. Unless you went to like, you know, school with like, a future NBA center or something like that. Um, the biggest kid in the class is going to be an early pubescent female. All right. And at that age, and this would be in middle school, they're growing and getting larger. And the last thing that these kids want is to feel different. They want to fit in. They want to be part of the crowd. They don't know, a lot of changes are happening. They don't know who they are very much. So they want to fit in as a way of feeling that they know who they are, that they have a sense of identity and belonging. Because internally things are about to get very confusing. And for these early pubescent girls, they're going to stand out and they're going to feel awkward and different, which is a stressor for a child in middle childhood. Not only are they standing out and feeling awkward, but they're treated by other people as if they were older and more mature. People look at their physical development and assume cognitively and emotionally that they're also, in proportion to their height. But that's of course not true. The domains are not all in lockstep. You could have a spurt physically, but it doesn't mean that your mentality, your cognition and thinking and emotional development, social development is also racing ahead. You could be in a body that looks like a teenager, but still be a child, in your mind and in your emotional life. And that's often the case. And yet people assume that the inner world is developing in pace with the outer world and may treat these kids and have expectations for these kids that are really out of step with their internal development, which is another pressure. And finally, for the girls, they're developing physically, and so they, oftentimes will appear to teenage boys like a teenage girl, and they'll be physically and sexually attracted to them, which could then have these girls be placed in positions and put in situations that they have no idea, how to navigate at all. And this is where all of these stressors are, where the attachment relationship is necessary to mentor them, to help them understand what's going on, to make sure they make good decisions, to protect them, and help them get through this period until the other girls catch up and their internal life catches up. If you have this kind of mentoring, if you have this guidance of a solid attachment with an older woman, trusted older woman, be it a sister, an aunt, a friend, a godmother, it could be anybody that you feel close with and trust who can guide you through this, then these girls later, weather this storm, and they could be leaders and in the class because they've gone through this process before the other girls. And many times they emerge as very popular, respected, and leaders if they can get through this more isolated change with the guidance of a more experienced woman. The other variation for girls is a late pubescent girl. And the main thing here is a sense of insecurity, that the girls see all the other girls changing and talking about different things, and and they just feel left behind. They feel like there's something wrong with them. They're inferior. They don't fit in. They have a sense of insecurity. So again, they need some support as well. And hopefully over time that they can be propped up and they'll get through this and be able to feel more like the other girls. Then for the boys, we also have the same kind of categories. We have early pubescent boys, and these boys on the positive side, let's go over the advantage. Um, the advantage is they're the genetic winners. I mean, boys, the society of boys is very based upon physical power, physical skill, um, even more than females. You know, if you break it down, it's like who could beat up who and who can outperform who in a physical level. This is a dominant kind of process in the society of young boys. And these early pubescent males, they just are the dominant boys in the physical domain. So they, you know, to get poetic, they rule the school. They're stronger than other boys, they're faster than other boys, they excel athletically, they're probably the captains of the sports team. They're more attractive to the girls, and no one is going to mess with them, and they can mess with anybody else. So they are in a genetically advantaged place. But that advantage can also turn to a disadvantage later, because the only reason that they are the leaders and in a dominant position in the school and in the society of boys is just a quirk of genetics. And ultimately, the other boys are going to catch up. So if they don't develop character and perseverance and habits of development in the sporting world, learning how to excel in their techniques and in their training, and they just rely upon genetics, eventually other boys are going to catch up and surpass them. So an early genetic advantage can turn into a disadvantage if that's all that is leading to your success, and there's nothing internally that you develop that propels you forward later on. And then finally, there's the late pubescent child, late pubescent male. Now remember, males develop physically after females on average. So the last one to have the physical development and the spurt will be the late pubescent male. Go back to your middle school picture again, and I'll bet you in 90% of the cases that the smallest kid in the class is going to be a late pubescent male. And these kids oftentimes have a rough time because they are smaller than everyone else. They can get pushed around and mistreated, not only by all the other boys, but the other girls, all the girls too. If push came to shove, can push them around too. So these kids live in a sort of constant state of inferiority and anxiety physically, and they also need a lot of protection. But if you look at these late pubescent boys, again, it's not all disadvantage, because these kids tend in adulthood to retain a kind of youthfulness and boyish quality. They tend to be more often than other groups creative. At the same time, they might be a little boyish in terms of impulsivity and irresponsibility. In their relationships with women, they're not macho, they're very equal and egalitarian, because any kind of sense of dominance has really been distilled out of them in these formative experiences. So these boys also need protection, they need insight, they need the skill of an older caregiver, an older attachment figure to help them navigate this. All right, so that concludes the presentation on physical motor, and when I'm back, we'll talk about adolescence, and social emotional development. Okay, I'm going to go wash my hands again. Bye.